society's changed, and back in the day, kids might be playing 8-10 hours of football 3-4 times a week, and the idea of street football, just going out and playing with their mates down the park. Now we possibly get kids for 1-2 hours a week, but what we can do is make it a fun and enjoyable experience, because our first response is to make sure they come back. What do kids enjoy? Games. So the biggest question coaches everywhere get asked is, when we having a game? Well, that might be a clue for us as adults to say, well, sometimes follow the wisdom of kids.
Welcome to the Liverpool FA podcast. Our aim is to provide regular insight from a variety of experts to help you in your own football journey. We'll do it through interviews, roundtable discussions, and by linking to other resources to help support you. For more information about each episode, just tap the album art, which will provide you with more about our guests and links to further content.
Our guests today are Mark Leigh and Simon Millington, who both work in coach development for the FA down in the southeast. The three of us sat down and recorded this episode in the summer during a get-together with our grassroots team. It was great fun to spend time with these two as we work at opposite ends of the country. In this episode, we focus mainly on practice, look into the returns players might get from different types of practice, and offer some practical advice on how you might plan and review your practices. I think you'll like this episode if you're a coach who has to plan your own sessions, and especially if you work with young players in the foundation phase. Since this episode was recorded, our colleague Pete Sturgis has launched the England DNA Foundation Phase, which is an incredible free resource accessible to anyone on Hive Learning. We'll have a link to that in the show notes, and we also have an episode coming up with Pete to discuss the Foundation Phase DNA in more depth. So enjoy this one with Mark and Simon. Simon Millington, Mark Leigh, welcome to the podcast. We are here at St George's Park, and we've had a great day with our grassroots coaching unit, looking at UEFA B content. We've spent the afternoon playing practicals on the indoor 3G there, and looking at you two, I honestly thought I was watching Tony Adams and Paul Gascoigne in their prime, and then the ball started rolling. So we'll get cracking with the interview or the conversation. Simon, county coach developer for Kent. Talk us through what a typical week might look like in your role.
Well, there's no such thing as a typical week in this role, which is fantastic. One week you could be delivering a level 1, the next week a level 2, seeing lots of variety, lots of different people from all different walks of life, in situ support visits. So the variety is absolutely fantastic for this role, and it's all about trying to develop coaches to help their players get better. So it doesn't feel like a job at all, really. It really feels like a privilege to go out and try and help these people develop their kids in the best way that they can.
Mark, same question. Can you tell us what a typical week might look like for you? So you're regional coach development manager for the South East.
Yep. Thanks, Jack. I'd agree with Simon. So lot of variety, a lot of different stuff. But typically our role would fall into delivering coach education courses, levels 1, 2 and 3, predominantly for grassroots audience. Some people from the programme would occasionally be on those courses. Supporting the tutor delivery. And then supporting coaches and clubs out in the community, in terms of either licensed coaches club events, CPD events, opportunities to see example practice sessions from experienced coaches, and probably the biggest and best change that's happened within the FA in the last 12-18 months is the fact that the courses now are blended. So rather than turning up, being told what to do and how to do it, it's very much more personalised, which means a lot of our time is spent going and watching coaches work in their own environment, which for me is fantastic because it's real and it adds a great deal of depth and colour to the coaching conversations that would typically take place on course. Not that the information and the feedback we're getting from the courses is not valuable. I think it's massively so, but the idea of actually personalising the learning and seeing real sessions in their own environment is probably the best thing that I enjoy about my job.
Talk us through how you got to where you are. So when did you start coaching? Place us where you were and give us some of the brief highlights up to your current role.
Yeah, I think I first started coaching in black and white. It was that long ago. So like most people, started out playing the game, loved the game, didn't quite make the grade as a player, came close, spent 2 or 3 years, associate schoolboy back in the day and YTS player, but wasn't going to ever make a living as a football player. The next best thing probably was to coach. So I was fortunate that I was guided by my parents to get involved at a young age. So I started coaching my brother's under 11 team at 16. That then led to an interest in sports science degree. So started coaching grassroots under 11s, age 16, progressed at 19, so that was while I was still playing. 19, 20, sports science degree, teacher training qualification. Spent 5 years teaching in a secondary school on the south coast, near Brighton. Then fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go and work for Adidas, running all of their schools programs, grassroots coaching programs. Fantastic experience, met a lot of really experienced coaches, broadened my horizons. Eventually came back into coach education, running my own business for 10 years, working as an affiliate tutor for the FA, level 1s, level 2s, the youth award courses. And then 3 years ago was fortunate enough to get offered a full-time position with the FA, and as Simon said, it's not really a job, it's a hobby that plays, basically. So yeah, that's my story.
Same question, Simon. Tell us how you ended up where you are, places where you were when you first started coaching.
Well, I was on a bricklaying course, and it was absolutely freezing cold one winter, and I thought, this isn't for me. I'm not made for this. So I said, well, what do I really love? And it was football coaching and being in and around football. So I took my FA prelim, and that started the journey. And then, like most young coaches at 21, I was trying to expedite my journey to a youth team position as quickly as possible. So I was looking to get qualified as quickly as possible. That allowed me to work at Portsmouth Community Trust, Kingston Rovers, a local team in Portsmouth that I helped work with, and had some great times there trying to develop young players. I look back and cringe a little bit now at the way I was. I was a bit of a boot camp Barry, used to shout and scream and instruct all the time. And it wasn't until I went travelling for a few years to South America and Australia and to play football. I just wanted to play football in Brazil, and had some wonderful times there. And it was like, well, what do I really want from this? You know, why am I involved in football? What's my love? It was like, I want to, as best I can, develop young players. So I went to live in London with Fulham Football Club Foundation, and that's where I started to work with disengaged teenagers, because it was a lot bigger challenge. And how do you get them people involved in sessions? But still with the dream of being a youth team manager somewhere. But several knockbacks, you start to question whether I've got the stuff, can I make it? And like Mark says, fortunate enough now that the FA gave me a role previously. I used to work as a Vauxhall youth officer, which pursued re-engaging teenagers who dropped out of the game. But then the coach education part came along, and it was a fantastic opportunity to influence more people, to try and stop them teenagers dropping out in the first place. How could we work on setting the right environment that they'd want to stay in the game as long as they could, rather than drop out? So that's really what's brought me to where I am today, and it's shaped my thoughts and philosophy on why I do what I do. I suppose I'm a little bit of an idealist in how I see things and how they should be structured. I know that doesn't suit everyone, but for me it works quite well, and I'm hoping that the messages I pass on to people inspires them to really help their young players develop better.
I want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned there. The main course of this episode is going to be around practice design and what are the ingredients that may make up effective practice design, but I can't let you off the hook without probing around your experiences in Brazil. So tell us what you learnt out there. Give us a bit of an insight as to what your experiences were.
I started off in Peru because I wanted to go and do the Inca Trail. So wherever you went, I wanted to try and pick up a game. So a place called, I can't even remember it, it's the mouth of the Amazon, and there's a little village town there, and you can play street football, so it's £1 each, or the equivalent of 10 centavos, and winner stays on. So we were playing street football under the street lights, met a local guide, he introduced me, we went down to play. And that was the real crux of it. I wanted to go and explore and play football in lots of different places across South America. So beach football in the Amazon, playing next to the river, down to Copacabana, and then into Argentina and Uruguay, to get an understanding of how they approach football, what their passions were. And the difference I noticed there, that when they talked about football, when they spoke about it, it was everywhere. And they went into a lot more detail than the discussions I had back in England. It seemed like it was their pure culture was, how do we overcome this problem, that problem? And obviously the debates about the manager and success and everything else. But they seem to talk about football from a younger age with younger people and try and educate them a little bit around the game. I think that leads to some of the gamesmanship we see in international football, and it was polar opposites. You played Brazilians, they'd fall over. You played Argentinians, and it was a good battle, which is more suited to the English style back then. So it was a real learning curve for me in relation to, well, I've got a different experience of football now. It's not just the perspective I've got from my development back in England. There is other ways, there is different approaches, which triggered in me, well, do I know as much as I think I know?
Fascinating stuff there. I haven't heard the word winner stays on, or the phrase winner stays on, for a long time, and it's just reminded me of back to my own school days when we went to a youth club on a Friday night and we played in a little school hall, and it got so competitive. It'd be roasting hot in there, and you were literally fighting for your right to play. We're gonna, as we travel through the podcast, we're going to look into the sorts of things that may motivate players and may keep them engaged within our practice design. But that did remind me of those days. Mark, we first met, I think it was about 4 years ago, and we were delivering a course together down in your neck of the woods.
That's right, East Grinstead, Module 3.
Yeah.
Remember it to this day.
Yeah, and
Still got the scars.
And I remember you taking the learners on the course through a process of planning, and you opened my eyes with some of the methods in which you got the learners to think about their practice design. What are some of the early experiences that you've had, and how has your view on practice design changed as your coaching journey has gone along?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Simon said he cringed, and I would actually, when he first started, in terms of some of the things he did, and I think we're all a product of our experience and experiences, and probably my generation, certainly brought up in the 70s, was very much, when we want your opinion, we'll give it to you. So I started coaching. I was still playing as a YT at my local club, Northampton Town at the time. Trained in the morning on a Friday, and copied verbatim that practice on a Friday evening with a bunch of 9 and 10, 11-year-olds, and spoke to them in the same way that we were spoken to by the coaches in the professional academy, which I'm sure everybody can imagine what that was like. It certainly wasn't a dialogue or a discussion. It was do this now because. And that's how I first started. And what was interesting about that was it was very well received in terms of the technical information I was giving over. And the parents thought it was good and it was structured. And at the time, I took that, and that inspired me to carry on. But I look back now, and embarrassing, really, in the sense that totally inappropriate content, totally inappropriate methodology. So the why you're doing it, the how you're doing it, and the what you're doing, probably embarrassing. If I look back on that now, but was probably better than what the kids had experienced in terms of some kind of structure. And again, obviously you go on from there and you do different things. And again, approach to games was very competitively driven. So it's interesting, we go through a transformation over a period of years and we forget what we were like. And then we talk to coaches and why is this coach behaving like this? And it's conversation with the guy the other night. I think a lot more now about involving the kids in the discussion. I'd never done that previously. And we just talked about why that was. His experience in school, very strict, do this now. And played in senior football, senior non-league. And I asked him the question at half-time when the gaffer's giving the team talk, did it ever occur to you to say, well, hang on a minute, we think this, we think something different because we're out on the pitch? And in a respectful way. And the answer was no. And I won't repeat the exact words he said, but the gist was, do it my way or you're up the road. And I think that's, we've moved a long way from that. And it's, for me, always about balance, isn't it? So I think different approaches, different ways of engaging players. But again, there's still that element of there are times when a structured, detailed practice is what's required. So I guess the right practice for the right player or players at the right time would be my approach, if you like. Other than that, try and keep it simple. Have very few templates. So I work predominantly with 5 to 11-year-olds foundation phase and probably have 5 favourite practices. And they're not actually 5 practices, they're 5 templates, which I might have 6, 8 variations of. So, within that you've probably got 30 or 40 variations, but very simple themes. And I think that's really helpful for coaches and really helpful for players. So, and again, internet's brilliant, technology's brilliant, Twitter, Facebook, sharing information. But I sometimes think as coaches we can get bogged down in content as opposed to this is the what I'm going to do as opposed to the why and the how I'm going to do it. So I would again, I'd caution that. Do you need another 28 passing practices, or will the 5 or 6 you've got be good enough to teach them the game?
Simon, Mark mentioned that there about us being a product of our experiences. I remember back to when I was a youth playing football, and our stable training session was a couple of laps of the pitch. We would then do what we called shuttles. They know them, I think, down in your neck of the woods as doggies, just sprints, suicides if you're from from the States. We would then get in a line of about 16 players deep, pass the ball into the coach and have a shot at goal. Sometimes it would hit the target, sometimes if it was me it would probably end up in the field. I'd have to then go and get it, give the ball back and join the back of the queue. And if we were lucky and we behaved, we might just get a match at the end. And that continued through to my early involvement as a player in adult football. And I can probably sense a lot of listeners nodding their heads in agreement here. Do you think that this is a process that Mark explained there that most coaches need to go through and break free from, where they may start with practices that they were brought up on, or a diet of practice that they were fed as a player when they first started coaching?
I think it's like a comfort blanket. It's what they know, it's where what they've experienced. So they have nothing to compare it with. So going back to what I said before, my eyes were open when I travelled a little bit. And on the beaches of Brazil, they're playing foot volley, which is volleyball with their feet, and it's 2-touch, and they play on deep sand. And you think the returns of playing on them surfaces and that game starts to give you different technical outcomes. Because I used to really believe that decontextualised drills, where I send the ball to you, you control it, get it down, send it back, was really helping young people nail down the technique that they could then take into the game. As I've progressed through my journey and I've been exposed to different mediums to gather information, I start to go, well, it doesn't make sense to me, because when you execute a technique in the game, you have to use a different variety of skills. So where's the ball coming from? What am I going to use? Where do I want to send it to? What will I do after? So before, during and after stuff is where coaches need to think about, what do I want my players to do with the ball in those stages? So when I started to think about, well, it needs to be in the context, I would start to think, well, I need to provide them with games or game-related practices where the execution of that will be higher. And as Mark's alluded to, there is times where you can definitely go back into a constant type practice, high repetition for certain players, because if you play lots of games, you might not get the repetition of the practice or the theme that you're after, and it's striking that balance, and it's the right practice, as Mark said, for the right players at the right time. And it's a real skill to try and pitch where that is. But I think that has to be based on analysis of your players and having an understanding of where they're at developmentally in relation to agility, balance, coordination and speed, and cognitively. What can they actually do? What can they execute at the moment? Am I asking too much of them? Are my expectations too high? And then trying to pitch it somewhere in there. And it does take time. You cannot cut corners. Unfortunately, it's not one of them things that can be just transplanted into your brain. You have to go out, and I think we'd all agree we've had lots of failures out on the grass. We don't deliver perfect sessions, so we are, always scratching our head about, well, I delivered that same practice to a different group of players yesterday, and it hasn't worked for this group of players today. And that's the environment that you're working in, the mood of the players that day, how your mood is affecting them. And it could just be the small interventions that you've used and now starting to work differently because these people don't respond to that. And it's trying to think, okay, what do these people respond to?
Okay, I'd just pick up on something that Si said there in terms of the before, during and after. I think that's a great almost framework or structure to help grassroots coaches in terms of understanding, and just to explain that for anybody that might not know, what does a player do before they get the ball? So looking to create space, looking to find space in order to receive or take players away from the play. What do they do when they've got the ball? So that would be the during, whether it's run with it, pass, shoot, dribble, turn, whatever it may be. And then what happens next? So the after, but then the after also becomes the before. And I think what that alludes to really is the decision making. So again, society's changed, and back in the day kids might be playing 8-10 hours of football 3-4 times a week, and the idea of street football, just going out and playing with their mates down the park. Now we possibly get kids for 1-2 hours a week, probably down to the individual to develop their own technical skills with contacts on the ball. We can support that to some degree. So then we go back to, well, if I get the players 1-2 hours a week, and I picked this up when I was a teacher, so secondary school teacher, I get 6 hours a year to teach them hockey or football or basketball. Realistically, I'm not going to improve their technical abilities dramatically in that time, but what we can do is make it a fun and enjoyable experience, because our first response is to make sure they come back the following week, so that's massive. What do kids enjoy? Games. So the biggest question coaches everywhere get asked is, when we having a game? Well, that might be a clue for us as adults to say, well, sometimes follow the wisdom of kids and say, if that's what they want, let's look at elements of giving them that. But if we are going to break down a practice to some core elements, then that element of decision making within there somewhere is key for me. And at the higher levels of the game, the technical abilities aren't that much different. You take outliers like Messi, Ronaldo out of the picture. It's the ability to make key decisions in tight areas when the muck and bullets are flying in the game. That's absolutely key. So I think that's fantastic. And if you look at Simon's experience in Brazil, best football nation on the planet, arguably, their kids play out in the streets all day, but then they have nothing else. So on the one hand, they produce great footballers. On the other hand, for our children, I don't think we'd wish for the lack of life chances and opportunities they get. But how do we then recreate that magic and that enjoyment and that freedom to express yourself in a game with your mates without the undue influence of an adult? And I think that would be a key message that I've adapted and changed in the way that I run my coaching sessions. It's more about them than it is about me.
This links back, this point I think links back to my previous role with how do we get disengaged teenagers who've dropped out of the game back into the game, and what do they want from their footballing experience. And Paul Holder at the time, who used to work for the FA, is now the academy director at Brighton. When he did some CPD with us, he said, well, look, these kids just want to play the game, but they've also expressed through the research that they want to get better at playing the game. So you have to devise practice types where they're playing the game, a small-sided version of it, on a five-a-side pitch, but will lead itself or lend itself to them being constrained or directed by the practice to try and get better at a certain type. So one of the practices that we used to do, and I think I've seen Ben Bartlett use it quite a lot, who works at the FA, is the number of passes you make and then you score will be your team's score. So I've just adapted that sometimes to help me get them to focus on penetration or passing forward. So it's only forward passes will count and then the score. So then players are starting to solve the problems. Well, how do we get the ball forward? What do I need to do with my body? So going to the before, during and after stuff. What does the run look like? When do I make that run? How do I receive? What does my friend do when I do that? But I haven't had to be explicit with that information. I haven't had to say, do this now. They've started to solve them problems by going through experience of, well, I probably ran too close to my friend there and that wasn't good. Maybe I should stay out the way, and to give him a pass to come back to me if that's the most appropriate thing to do. And we saw the evidence of it when we got the teenagers in. The numbers started to grow and they were loving the games, and they would then be in a position to start creating their own. We could start saying to them, well, look, you've seen the format of what we've produced. Surely you can come up with something yourselves. And they would start to chip in and go, well, maybe we could have this rule, or maybe we could have this type of finish. And then you just go with that and see how it worked. Now, if it didn't work, or it wasn't particularly successful, then it was being in a relaxed environment to go, okay, let's change it. It doesn't really matter. You know, we're working in a recreational arena. We want people to have fun, experiment, practice stuff, and hopefully get better over time. And it's not having expectations to see them improve immediately, because you have to have an understanding. You can't see immediate improvement when working with young people, because their journey is inconsistent and, you know, twisty and turny. It doesn't just go in straight lines. So you have to be patient, and I would say when designing practices, grassroots coaches or any coach needs to just be patient in regards to, well, what do I want these players to actually be better at in the long term? What's the final? What's the end game?
It's funny that you mentioned Paul Holder there, because Paul is somebody who's probably had the biggest impact on me in a short period of time as a coach. I was lucky enough to spend 4 days with him back in around 2008 at Lancashire FA, and I came away from that place with my head in a complete mess. In a good way. And he, in such a short period of time, made me think completely different about what I was doing, why I was doing it, how I designed practice, and led me on a different trajectory, I suppose. I want to go back to, Mark, something that you said earlier on around, well, firstly, when you mentioned about you started playing in black and white, I found my first youth football photograph, my first team photo recently, and I'm shocked to say it was in black and white, which was unfortunate. I want to look into some of the challenges that coaches face out there, and maybe some of the pressures or things that might influence their practice design that maybe they don't want to. Once we tackle that, I want to start to give the listeners some insight into where they might start, what processes they might go through to start to create practices from scratch, rather than having to rely on external sources. But you reminded me of my first experiences of planning my own or trying to draw upon sources for my own practice design, and I would literally buy books from a library, open them up, go through page by page, and I would the first thing I would do was look at the number of players in the diagram, and if that number matched the number of players in my squad, then I wouldn't discard it. Otherwise, I would turn the page. And nowadays, with, like you say, with the internet and the amount of information that's freely accessible to coaches out there, it can be quite problematic for coaches to sift through and realise why they're doing what they're doing. Another pressure I felt earlier on in my coaching journey was the pressure from the sidelines, so the parents watching their children, and I felt as though my practices had to be neat and tidy and clean and in lines and look good and always having success, so that I would almost get that nod of approval from the parents. Is this something that you resonate with? Is this something that you see with the coaches you work with?
Massively. And just picking up at that point, practice needs to be organised, structured, straight lines, look good. So that's about us, and that's about the parents, not about the players. So one of the biggest changes in my coaching over the last 7-8 years is a direct result of the youth awards and the fact that I don't have to be perfect. So I came from the mindset that as the coach, I need to be in control of everything, and I need to be almost word perfect in my delivery and what it looks like, and actually that's just totally unrealistic. That's not going to happen. The second thing to say there is coaching isn't easy. You're on stage, you're in front of an audience, it has the potential to go wrong quite quickly. So for anybody, coaching isn't easy. So give yourself a break as a coach sometimes, particularly so if you're a volunteer grassroots coach that has other commitments, and your main motivation for turning up week in, week out, come rain or shine, for at least 10 months of the year, is just to provide a nice opportunity for the young players in your community. So, and I think sometimes we get carried away with the detail and overlook the fact that for a vast majority of coaches, they just want to provide opportunities for young players, and where that takes the young players, who knows, but some will just play and enjoy the game, some will move into coaching, some might make it to the highest echelons of the game, but it's all built off the back of the willing efforts of volunteers. So that's my starting point, is understand the context and the difficulties they face. The next thing probably, we're having that much fun I can't keep count of my points. I think it's the third thing actually, if anybody's counting, is this idea that planning takes time, and that's a precious resource for volunteer coaches, for all coaches. So sometimes, certainly in my early years and also today occasionally, the first time you get a chance to think about the session is when you're driving to it, and that's the reality. So that would be the case. The other thing is there's a lot of pressure in terms of what perceptions of the coach should be doing, and I'll give you an example. I did a session recently, under 9 players, working with the coaches. So my role was to support the coaches, and we looked at some ideas. They did some good stuff, doing a lot of good stuff, but just needed the next impetus to say, well, what else? How can we improve these practices? So because they're under 9s, they didn't particularly need to warm up. We started by playing games across the pitch, turn up and play, there's a bib, put it on. What that meant was kids would get there on time, because there's a reason to get there on time. It meant that kids were getting different experiences with their mates, so it's just me playing with my mates. They'd get different overloads, so me and Si turn up 1v1, Jack arrives 2v1, somebody else comes in 2v3, so you're getting different experiences. You can set up different conditions on each pitch. And the other thing is, I think, as you say, if I need 12 players for this session, and if I don't get 12, I'm sending everybody home, because I will struggle to know what to do and adapt on the fly, which again is something that takes time and practice and experience, versus the kids are playing, the kids are having a nice time. That frees the coach up to then have a look and go, well, I was hoping to get 12, but I've only got 9. Now I can start to think about what am I going to do differently. Things like what the kids are like when they get there. So speak to coaches recently. Saturday morning's practice is great because the kids are engaged, they've had some sleep, and these are working with under 12s, by the way. Might be different as they get a bit older. During the week we tend to keep things simple because they've had a long day at school, and physically and mentally they can't cope with too much complexity. So that was great insight from the coaches, and again, it's something we overlook. But But so the kids are playing. What that does is give buys the coach a bit of time to think on their feet and say, well, actually, what am I going to do next? And the answer is, if the games are going well, nothing for a while. Let the kids play. The kids never heard kids go, this is rubbish because we're playing a game when we're going to do a line drill, for example. I stand to be corrected by anybody out there that has had that, but I've certainly never experienced it. You can also look at the mood of the kids. So, we talk about the technical and tactical aspects of the game because that's our focus as professionals that work at the FA and have a responsibility for educating coaches. But there's also other aspects in terms of, the first thing is, let's develop some good people. So let's look at the social interaction. Is this child being bullied? Is this child need bringing down a peg or two, for want of a better phrase? It's probably not the right phrase, but do we need to challenge this child differently? How do we support this child that struggles psychologically? How do we help this child that's gone through a little dip in performance lately, or their pet's just died? Sounds ridiculous when we're talking about the development of football in this country, but that's the reality for young players and the coaches that have to interact with them. So back to the story 20 minutes ago. We then decided to put on a practice where it was a 3v2 or a 4v3 attacking game. Kids could choose. They played the game. We gave them a couple of pointers here and there, but played a lot. Said to the coaches, we're now coming towards the end of the session, last 15 minutes, you've got a decision to make. Practice is going really well. Do you continue? Or do we now go back into some kind of game, because that will conclude it nicely? And the coach said, what should we do? And I said, well, you could ask the kids. And longish story, slightly shorter. They said, can we do that? I said, yeah. So they didn't know that was an option available to them. I said, yeah, let's just ask the kids. Half the group said, we want to play a game. The other half said, we want to continue with the practice. The coaches looked at me and said, what do we do now? I said, that. Coaches thought it was brilliant. Kids thought it was brilliant, which is not about me, but that was quite pleasing, to a job well done, which we all enjoy, which is why we get into coaching, to help people enjoy and be better. Came back the next week, they said, hope you don't mind, we asked the parents what they thought of the session. And I laughed because I knew what was coming. And I said, what did they say? They said, wasn't a lot of coaching going on. And I said, depends on your view of coaching. If your view of coaching is I'm always the centre of attention, then agree. There wasn't. Maybe a better question is, was there a lot of interaction and enjoyment and learning going on? Now, that's a difficult one to answer because, as I said, learning is not linear. It's messy, it's complicated, hard to judge because you can't physically see it always. But I think that would be, my perception on it in terms of, where we might look to almost, for want of a better phrase, and it's a bit of a cliche, give the game back to the kids a little bit. But within that, recognise that the pendulum shouldn't swing so far that as coaches the message is you don't coach, you don't do anything, you just stand there and facilitate. Because facilitation is sometimes the right thing to do, but sometimes players and grass coaches have a thirst for that knowledge. They want to improve, they want to be better, and it's that balance, isn't it? How many times do I watch a child get it wrong before I go, actually, I've got a bit of knowledge, can come up with a better way? And sometimes that will be stage in the learning process. It will be time available. So, anecdote, my daughter's 17 now, she can tie her own shoelaces. Big plus for me as a parent, well done. When she was 3, she couldn't. So some mornings we would spend 20 minutes going through the process of meticulously trying and failing and frustrating. Other mornings would be sit there, put those on, I'll tie them up, get in the car. One of the big differences was time available. If it's a school day and we're running late, I'm going to deal with that for you. So again, it's the context and what we want the outcome to be. So no problem helping people in the short term, but understanding where that leads them to in the long term.
I think linked to that, I know it's quite popular at the moment, letter to my younger self. And if I was to give my younger self some advice, it would reiterate what Mark said. The first thing I would ask them is, why are the kids there? What do they want from this? What do they want from me? What do they enjoy? And what do they want to get better at? Because I think as long as you've got an understanding of why they're there, what do they want to get better at, you've got a start point. You've got something that if they enjoy shooting, finishing, and that's big for them, then why not give it to them? From a coaching perspective, if they're your team and you want them to get better at defending, you just dress up an attacking practice or a defensive practice as an attacking practice. You're going to say, well, we need some people in there to make it harder for us to score goals, because that's what we'll encounter at the weekend. And then you get some volunteers to go in there and you'll say, look, we can rotate around this. Everyone will have an experience of finishing, passing, defending, saving goals. So we all get to understand what we enjoy. Because I think a lot of young people get pigeonholed too quickly by their coaches or their parents. You're quite tall, or I played in goal, so you're playing goal, or you're a defender, you're fast, you can go up front. And it's that pigeonhole of kids way too young. You know, I see it under 6s, 7s. They're making decisions on young people based on their physical stature, and it's like, well, you don't know what this child's able to achieve, so why would you start to pigeonhole them and go, I think you're a fullback, I think you're a centre back, and that's the only place you're ever going to play for me. And the other point that Mark made about putting on a show for the parents, I read an interesting research paper by Robin Jones around coaching face, and that really brought it to life for me, that you end up putting on a show for the parents. And if you work in some environments, it could be your employer. Your employer wants you to be demonstrative, instruct, where if we're saying that we want kids to be really good problem solvers or decision makers, we rob them of that opportunity through instructing all the time from the sideline. And I see it a fair bit in my role where there's coaches on the side trying to talk children through a game. And like Mark said, his daughter now is 17, she can do her own shoelaces. You know, would there have been any benefit for her if he just constantly talked to her every day about how to do it, or would it be better saying, look, I've shown you a couple of ways, you work out how to do it for yourself? Because I think ultimately, as people who want to help kids understand football, we need to give them problems to solve related to the game. And this should be easy for grassroots coaches, because they would see problems every time their team play. They would see areas where they think, I wish we were a little bit better at this. I wish we could combine better within midfield. So that might be the start point for where their session would be started, or when they're starting to think about, well, what do I want from tonight's session? As Mark said, if you haven't got the planning time, if you know that the problem is we want to get better at playing in midfield, place your practice where that would happen. Ask your players, why are we not being successful at combining in midfield, and then let them have a go at trying to see if they could come up solutions for why they're not doing it so well. And then if they can't give you clear pictures of success, that's where a coach might go in and think about, well, here's a question that might get you to consider, have you gone in too soon? Have you killed your mate's space? What's the angle? What's the distance? And I know there are things with a little bit more detail that they'll get at level 2 and level 3 courses, but they're simple questions that if they ask their players would give them a response. And it's not always verbalising that response. It's okay, look, you've come up with some brilliant stuff, show me, see if we can execute it out on the pitch. And I was first introduced to this by a book I read by Lynn Kidman, Athlete-Centered Coaching. And she was working with more elite performers in New Zealand, but I could see there was real relevance to grassroots players anywhere. It's just, look, we're struggling to get the ball into the goal from wide areas, so let's practice on that. Who's got solutions, ideas for how we could do that? And then the players start to take ownership of what they want to get better at. They will come up with solutions around where to deliver, how to deliver. And it's easy to see from the practice if they're not being successful, because they'll lose the ball, the other team will gain it and then go and try and score in their goal. So then they have to try and work out, well, how could we do this better? And I think what she used to do, and I've seen Ben Bartlett do it very well, is start to give some of them players challenges around certain elements of the game. And it could be, Mark, when that ball's being crossed in, where could you go to? Could you attack the near post? Could you attack the far post? Once you've got there and the ball's arrived, what could you do differently? And then that player just experiments and practices working out ways of timing the run based on the triggers that the game is giving them and their colleagues and the opposition are, which, decontextualised practices, like I've mentioned before, don't really give you them returns that would help them develop further.
Just for full disclosure for the listeners, Mark had to run off to the loo just after he finished speaking then, so you filled in for him perfectly there, Simon. You gave him enough time to get back in and work his way back into the conversation. A couple of things I want to touch on that you mentioned there, Simon, and it reminds me of a phrase that one of our colleagues, Pete Sturgis, uses quite a lot when he's talking about practice design and certainly working with young players, is disguised hard work. So I haven't met too many young players who are, let's say, mini soccer age, under 10 and below, who come to me and go, Jack, really want to work on defending tonight. But what you can do, like you said, is if we arrange the practice in the right way, they will be working or practicing defending, but without you necessarily letting them know that that's the complete focus of the session.
A term I've picked up from Mark previously on courses is the hidden curriculum. So you already know what you want them to achieve, but you dress up the practice with a focus that is what they enjoy, but it will also help them get better. So they can see the benefits from two sides. I enjoy doing this, so I'll work quite hard to do it, because it's not a chore. And I know that there's certain elements to it that I want to get better at, because I want to be the best footballer I can be. So I will apply myself in relation to challenging myself to do things that are harder, because I think it's vital that if we're going to get young people to develop, they have to be challenged just beyond where they're currently at. It has to be just above where they're at, and it will. If you give it the enjoyable spin, you dress it up in a way that they really want to engage in, they will work tirelessly, like we used to when we used to go over the park and just have pick-up games with our friends. But we're there where we can accelerate that learning a little bit, where we would just play. We can almost probe and challenge a little bit to get them to come to solutions a bit quicker than maybe we were afforded, which for me is vital, that they need to self-discover almost.
So we've looked at some of the challenges that coaches may commonly face when they're faced with design in practice. Going back, you mentioned a reward type practice that you picked up off our colleague Ben, number of passes you make equals number of goals, and so on. And I compare and contrast that to a common restriction that coaches place on their practices, which is everyone's got to touch the ball before you score a goal. Done with the best of intentions, but can often create those unrealistic scenarios where little Johnny or little Jane is the last player who hasn't touched the ball, and the team out of possession go, we know you can't score, so we're going to swarm that player there, thank you very much for the ball back. What are some of the other common mistakes or pitfalls that both of you see coaches making when designing practice, often done with the best of intentions, but with maybe not the outcomes that they were looking for?
Okay, so firstly, I can't believe you've outed me for nipping to the loo. All I can do is apologise to listeners. Secondly, is Simon Ben Bartlett's agent? Because that's like 3 mentions now, so, he's good, but there are limits. No, all joking aside, I've forgotten what I was going to say now. What was the question? I think, people talk about be careful of making statements in practice or instructions to players, always, must, never, can't, because you want that freedom. And again, there are times when we see sessions, playing through the thirds where players will be locked in for a certain amount of time. So an understanding from the coach of why that's being done, and early in the session to help establish structure and shape. I think the big one for me is, particularly as players develop some knowledge and understanding, is be mindful of a practice where a player says, but I would never do that in a game. That situation would never, or extremely rarely, happens in a game. And I think Steve Holland, the Chelsea first team coach and now England coach, senior coach, talked about trying not to stray too far away from the game, and I think that would be a good methodology. So keep it simple, relate it to the game, and again, sometimes if you're struggling as a coach to go, well, where do I take this practice? What do I do with it? Ask the players. What we overlook and forget is that the players experience other good coaches, and again, the interesting thing for me is if you have the players' best interests at heart. And it comes back to this control thing. We're fearful sometimes of saying, I don't know. Well, if your methodology and your approach is to be always on the player's case when they make a mistake and they get things wrong, and if that's your style, then I think you're probably not going to be able to make a mistake or open up yourself, because the first time you do that, players are going to give you some of that back. But if you are genuinely working with the best interests of the player's heart and you can do it together, there might be times where you say to the players, well, what do you think? What can we do differently here? And they might come up with some good suggestions. So then it's a win-win, because everybody gets a better practice that you can take forward in your coaching journey, and the players can as well. Those would be some key things for me. And again, I think we talked about the internet, and that's a brilliant resource. But there's two aspects to that I would caution against. One is just downloading content without understanding the why. What am I focusing on tonight? Because there can be a scattergun approach to under 11s. We're coaching a session. It's meant to be around passing and receiving. So we would praise good play regardless. But we might just restrict our comments, in terms of any critical comments or advice or feedback to just that topic, as opposed to, and I worked with an under 10 coach once, lovely, great coach, very enthusiastic, but within 3 minutes of the practice starting was, you can't edit, your shoot's not right, your goal. And I said, well, hang on a minute. I said, they're 10. They won't get all of it right all of the time. So having a clear focus and just dealing with that a session at a time, as I think Si mentioned, would be key. I think those would be some aspects for me.
I mean, for me, the point you make, Jack, is really relevant, but on the flip side, it shows that the kids are solving those problems, because they've worked out, little Johnny needs to now have his touch. We can mark little Johnny, which produces a new challenge for the coach, because the coach now has to think of, have I got a plan B? Have I preempted any of this? And have I got something up my sleeve that, I know that we can go in a new direction with it? And also the expectations of what the practice will return. Sometimes people think that it's going to be all singing or dancing and it will solve all their problems, and it's like, well, the practice will return certain things. Your bright children will work out the most efficient way to play the game, and then if that then throws you off kilter 10 minutes into your practice, do you then go, okay, that's it, we now need to go and work on something else? Or do you just go, like Mark said, right, we seem to have come to an impasse. We've come to a place where the practice isn't working as well, and just basic progressions and regressions. What could we do to make this more challenging for you? And then they can come up with their solutions. I think if the coach has looked at his squad and he's done the what do you enjoy, what do you want to get better at, all players will have something that they want to get better at within any practice. But it's mindfulness of, well, am I producing players to just be fullbacks, to just be centre backs, or am I encouraging them to have a rich experience of football in all the facets as they go through the different formats of the game?
Again, just picking up Si's point there about we've reached an impasse, the thing's not quite working. I think in teaching they call it with-itness, which is the ability to recognise what's come in next and nip it in the bud, almost preempt what's happening next. And I think one of the things I talk to coaches a lot about is try and look out for changes in tempo, lots of unforced errors, or changes in behaviour. Those would be some clues that we might need to move the thing on, because the kids are either bored, or they've had enough, or they're over challenged with this. It's too much for them. So yeah, those would be some aspects I'd look at. And again, a couple of things you can have in your back pocket. What might be called energizer games. So if you come to a lull and you're thinking, okay, this isn't quite happening, favourite practice or favourite games that you develop, and you have a repertoire that sometimes you'll play, but sometimes you'll save for that ability to energise players. So that would be good. And you can always default to a game, because very rare will players complain about that. And again, you can do that disguised by just saying, right, now we're going into a game and that was my plan all along. Or you can be open and honest with players and say, look, I didn't quite get that right, I've messed that up, I'll go away and have a think about it and come back next week. Because we've all experienced that situation where we know something's not quite right about the practice, but we don't have the mental capacity or the experience to recognise it there and then we drive home in the car and we think about it and we go, oh yeah, should have done that. Or somebody points that out to you as you come off the pitch and you go, yeah, you're right, but I'm not yet experienced enough at doing that again and again to identify it straight away. So yeah, those would be some things that I would look at as well, to help your practice flow well.
You remind me of a session a couple of weeks ago that I had with the kids that I coach at the moment, and we train on the park at the moment, summertime, so we can train for an hour and a half. We've got a couple of fold-up goals, 9 players, because it was half term, and we just played a game. It used to be on the level 1. It was called Diamonds Are Forever, and I had very little intervention. We just tried to manage the game to get that competitive balance as close as I possibly could. As Simon just said, I suppose, trying to get that challenge to its optimal zone. And the parents had to drag us off the pitch. It was nearly dark by the time that we finished. We ran over by so much time because the kids were demanding more. And I came away from that session absolutely buzzing, just like the kids. That was a practice that I probably haven't delivered for several years, but it just dawned on me at that moment, at that night, with those players, it just felt right. And my job was to try and get the players to that zone where they're all challenged just beyond where they're currently capable. And that was just something that Simon triggered in me before. You spoke about changes in tempo. I want to change the tempo in this conversation right now. Scenario: I am a coach who has to plan as part of my role. So I know some coaches out there are given a curriculum. They have to follow that curriculum. But that's not me. I'm a coach who has to plan as part of my role. Where do I start? It's 5 o'clock. I've just finished work. The session starts at 6. I'm on the drive home. I haven't planned a thing. What on earth am I going to do? What sort of process can you take me through from tee to green that's going to help me to deliver effective practices and sessions?
Okay, so you just talked about Diamonds Are Forever, Jack. I referenced earlier 5 favourite practices. That would be one of them, because what does it have? It has elements of the game, so it's competitive. It replicates elements of the game in terms of attack, defence, changes of possession, transition. It's enjoyable and exciting because we get to score lots of goals. It can be focused on defending. It can be focused on attacking. It can be focused on the goalkeepers playing out. It can be focused on shot stopping. It can be focused on, there are a number of different focuses you could use that for. So a couple of things I'll pick up on. One is the physical process of going through designing the practice. And I was asked this question recently on the course: how and where do you start? And I see lots of what I would term whizzy practices, and I probably don't have enough time in the day to design practices like that. But my next question to myself is, why would I need to? So in answer to the question, how do you start to design practices? typically, and this may sound flippant, but it's not meant to. Typically, I will start with a rectangle and a halfway line. That would be my default option to start with, and I'll probably put a goal at either end, and I'm sure people and the players would recognise that from somewhere. And again, there's different formats. I mean, again, everybody else has mentioned him, so I will as well. Ben Bartlett did an article in the Bootroom a while back called 6 Steps to Designing Effective Practice. And again, I'm sure we can put that in the show notes. I've no idea what that means, but I heard Tim Ferriss say it once, so it must be good. So anyway, Ben talked about having 4 very simple practice structures: big pitch, small pitch, wide pitch, narrow pitch. He then, I think he called them parameters. I would call them pitch markings, because I'm nothing if not simple. And his pitch markings were halfway line, thirds going across the pitch, channels going down the pitch, or a centre circle or an area to play through the middle. And then he'd do some other stuff in terms of restrict, reward, relate. And what he means by that is restrict might be you must, you can't, you must play through the thirds in order to score. Relate, try and recognise when to play through the thirds. Reward, if you play through the thirds and score, it's worth 2 goals. So that would be a really simple approach. You then take another esteemed colleague, former colleague now, John Allpress, who was responsible largely for designing the Module 3 in consultation with others. And John had a very clear process. Deciding a focus, what we're going to work on tonight. And that could be, depending on where you work, that could be a curriculum, it could be your own ideas, it could be, I'm on my level 2 and I'd like to practice this. It could be modern trends in the game, so people, we'd like to overplay in midfield or overload the midfield in order to dominate possession, or we like to defend deep in order to counter. We've seen those elements of the game. So some aspect of play, it could be, if you're in the performance zone, you're working with older, more senior players, it could be linked to what happened last Saturday or what we want to happen next Saturday. So all of those are valid rationales for coming up with a focus. There's not just one way to get there. Decide a focus, design a practice structure that supports that focus. So if, as Simon said, it's playing in wide areas, can we get opportunities to get the ball into wide areas again and again and again within that practice? Set some challenges, ask some questions, review progress periodically throughout the session. And then at the end of that, either revisit or move on to the next element. And again, something that Paul Holder talked about was, for us as coaches, coaching curriculums are great because it helps us structure. This week I'm doing passing, next week I'm doing dribbling, then we'll do some shooting. It's brilliant for us as adults and coaches because it helps us think about what we're going to do week on week. But that's not how kids learn the game. Kids play football. So we don't say on a Saturday morning, right, today we're away at Chelsea, at Stamford Bridge, we're going to be focusing on passing today. No, we're going to focus on trying to play football today. And that's the reality of it. So that would be some keys for me.
Something that I've been introduced to recently that I need to do a little bit more research into is Interleaving, and it's the sessions that you did previously and reconnecting the players with that again at the start of your new session. So going back to Mark's point about the practice is up and running, it gives the coach thinking time. So he's got that hour in the car. What did we do last week? Who do we work with? How can we then deliver that again this week? When I've got that thinking time based on who's arrived, what their mood's like, what they want to do, then you should have a good platform to take the session from there. And it links to that program that Mark said. If you've been working on sending and receiving the ball in certain areas of the field, and it was midfield last week, it could just be now that you're trying to think, well, what would we go next? Would we go midfield to attack, and what does that look like, and who are the players involved, and what would I give them individually? So it's great that Mark said that you interleave, give them a little chance, play a game which gives you a bit more time, and then that gives you the time to do maybe a more deconstructed session. It could be. I'm a big advocate of whole part, whole coaching, something that I utilise all the time. And a part would be the game or the theme of the session decontextualised a little bit, so it's not the pure game. It could just be, well, we're working with midfield and attack combining, so we'll place the practice in that area of the field, and that these are the players who are involved, and this is what I would like them to try and get better at in this segment of the session. So they've had a bit of time interleaving, they've had a game for 10-15 minutes, then you might do 10 to 15 minutes on the part and breaking it down a little bit further, but still it's contextualised because they've got friends, they've got people involved who are posing them problems, and then go back into the game to see if the kids have been able to apply some of the stuff that they've picked up back into the game format.
How important is it when you're working with your, especially young developing players? You mentioned interleaving. I'm assuming that would, in my language, in my head, that's kind of revisiting. So going back, almost starting from where you finished off on the last session and trying to progress on further. How important is that with the young developing player, if we're trying to help them to learn the game, to stick at a focus for a period of time, as opposed to, this is what we didn't do very well at the weekend, therefore we're going to do this? And can you make an argument either way for each?
I think reactionism, and reacting to results can mean you just bounce around and it's not coherent. If you've got an idea of a plan of, well, they're under eights, I want them to be running with the ball, travelling with the ball as often as possible, so that's what predominates my sessions, and these are the individuals I would like to get even better at recognising when and how to. If you can connect back, it gives the players an opportunity to review what you did last week. What did they take away from it? Has any of it retained? Because if you say, right, do you remember how we finished up last week's game? What the challenges were at the end? Can you set that up and run so I can have a look to see what you've retained? Then the players will be able to show you if they have or if they haven't. And then you can go, okay, well, maybe I didn't get that across as well as I would like. How could we do that better? But you've also got the session where you're going to take it on. All right, I'm going to try and build on that, but we'll touch back on the stuff that we covered last week, maybe around type of pass, weight of pass, timing of run for the receiver. Because I think if you do just react all the time, it's so ad hoc. You will get returns from it, yeah, you will, but they won't give you as many returns potentially as having a nice block of work where the message is consistent through 5 or 6 weeks, and the players getting a chance to apply those themes maybe just in different areas of the field and seeing, well, what does it look like in defence to midfield to attack, and how does that affect you as the individual within it, and what can you do to develop that? But additionally, it's not just the one corner. We do get bogged down in the physical and the technical tacticals rather than looking at the psychological and social side of players' development. And it could be, if I want them to be responsible for their own development, have I set them something to come back with for next week where they can take a bit of ownership of the start of the practice, the start of the session, which can show me how they can self-manage, self-organise in relation to certain things. You may have even asked them to come up with some ideas around how to get a practice up and running, especially around agility, balance, coordination, speed development. I think a lot of younger under 11 players really would benefit from that. So they could come up with some fantastic tag games but connected to the session, that then would lead you into your next bit of practice if you haven't had the time to plan as much detail as you would like to.
Okay, I'm just to add to that, I'm certainly no expert on skill acquisition, but listeners might be interested to look at the work of Mark Williams in Liverpool John Moores in this country, and a gentleman called Damien Farrow at the Australian Institute of Sport, who've looked into this quite a lot among other researchers. And I think the general approach to date has been variable or random practice, so we intersperse different elements. So rather than doing dribbling for 20 minutes and focusing on a step over or a Matthews or Beckham dribble, depending on your generation, we might interleave that with so you dribble, then you receive a player 1-2, and then you get a shot off, and then you have to go and defend the next one. So that would be an example of more variable or random practice. So I think, generally speaking, the research suggests that variable or random practice is better for long-term retention of information, and I believe it's something to do with the fact that players have to constantly think about what they're doing, which makes it more memorable, versus I don't have to think about something because I know I'm going to be doing the same thing over and over again. The counter-argument to that, particularly with young players or beginners, there is some evidence to suggest that block practice, in terms of developing those neural pathways, developing the mechanics in the early stages, can be more beneficial than random practice. So there almost needs to be recognising where the player's at in their learning and their understanding, and also recognising, maximising the time available. So in terms of, one of the things we practice is have a clear session structure that you stick with for a few weeks, so kids arrive knowing roughly what's going to happen. And again, not a problem at all. Good practice to actually dedicate a certain amount of time to individualised practice or small group work, but then counter that with the benefits of what's the best use of my time when I've paid 35 quid or more for a third of the Astro as a grassroots coach, and I've got 14 players here. So it's almost understanding what's the best use of our time in that situation.
Yeah, I'm going to out Simon. So Simon's the latest of our lavatory casualties. We'll fill in while he's away.
Very unprofessional in my book.
Extremely. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Mark. I'm going to give you a scenario. Talk us through how you would deal with it. So I'm an under-8 coach. I have a squad of 10 because we're just about to move to under-9 next season. Simon mentioned about staying on the ball, mastering the ball, dribbling, running with the ball might be at that age group a relevant thing to focus on. I've got a third of an Astro. What do? I want to design and develop a practice that's going to help them to stay on the ball, master the ball, and encourage them to dribble. By the way, I'm driving to the session now.
Yep.
Talk me through your process.
Okay. Rectangle.
I thought you might start with that.
With a halfway line. And I'll explain why. So I think the whole thing about... so there's the mechanics of give me contacts on the ball, but the whole thing about dribbling and the whole thing about the game is recognition of time and space and recognition of opportunities and threats. So if we set up a practice structure in where time and space is limited, we can then think about the step principle to manipulate that practice, so space, task, equipment and players. And one of the benefits of having a halfway line in is I can manipulate the space without moving a single cone, because I can play in the whole rectangle, play in both halves. If the players can cope with that easily, and again, hopefully I'd know my players, but sometimes you have new players or you don't know who's turning up. Without changing a single thing, I can play in half the rectangle. And then things like, does everybody have to stay in the rectangle, or is there a safe area where certain players can move out of that and move back into it? Do we have, and again, there's a game through the gate and there's variations on that. So whilst I'm dribbling around the area, it's not just a random dribble. I'm trying to achieve something, whether it be score through a gate or get the ball to the other end. So those would be key things I would look at. Under 8s, one of the things they struggle with is that directly approach practice. So I often see practices where the under 8s, under 9s will work with ball each, no opposition, and then they'll go into a 4v4 game. So well done, because it's 4v4, not 9v9, but I've seen that as well. So playing with small numbers, but actually 4v4 you'd be better off playing 6v2 and then rotating the 2 or 5v3 or some variation thereof. So you manipulate the practice to the stage of learning that the players are at. And this probably relates back to a previous point I made a bit earlier where we talked about do you need loads and loads of templates, or do you just need a few variations? And I think what sometimes we can get carried away with is give me more content without actually unpicking what does this practice do for me and the players, or what can I do with this practice, and that would be absolutely key to me. So have a progressive and linked series of practices that allow players to work at their own level. And again, don't be frightened to split the groups in different ways. So sometimes with friends, sometimes big uns on one pitch, little uns on the other, because the physical demands can dictate. Sometimes playing in a tight area, sometimes playing in a big area. So tight area, we need to be good at staying on the ball. Bigger area, we need to recognise and know what it feels like to actually travel over distance. And sometimes I might split it based on ability, to say, well, this group over here in this rectangle are working on something different to this group over here. That's okay. So if you were a maths teacher, you might have 3 different groups. Table 1's working on addition, table 2's working on subtraction, table 3's working on multiplication. Well, if somebody can deal with addition, no problem. It doesn't make any sense to keep them there when they could be moving on to more demanding tasks such as subtraction or multiplication. So I think manipulate the practice using the step principle to kind of challenge and support players appropriately.
Simon, we were talking before we hit record, and you mentioned how important it is that coaches are open to critique. So if I was going to take this almost like a cycle, so Mark just talked us through a planning process, how that may be then delivered in practice. Carrying on the analogy of an under-8 squad, how might I as the coach make myself open to critique, to find out actually what did the players get, what did they enjoy, what are some of the methods that coaches might use that could help them with that. And bear in mind, by the way, we booked the AstroTurf 6 till 7, and at 7 o'clock there's a group of adults who come on after us and kick us off, so we have literally got 1 hour. We might have a little bit of pitch space at the side.
If they've got a whiteboard, one of the simple ways just to measure for under-8s definitely is just put smiley face, okay face, sad face, and just ask the players to tick in where they're sitting at that moment in time. And now that could be quite daunting for younger ones to tick in, but that would be the start of the process, because you want to find out, are they happy with the type of stuff that they've encountered this evening? If they're not happy, why not? What could you have done better? And I don't think it should happen at the end. I don't think you should review just at the end of the session, how did everyone think it went? It should be an ongoing process throughout the session. You should be talking to them again, and I think Mark mentioned it previously, is read the mood of the group. Is this challenge too hard? Is it too easy? Has the tempo changed? Are we seeing too many mistakes, errors, or opportunities to learn based on how you view them? And then asking the players, is there anything I could do to make this harder, easier? Could I change the size? Could I make it bigger for you? Do you want a time limit? And just getting their feedback. I think with under-8s, it has to be light. So I remember when I used to work within community schemes and we'd run holiday courses, you had to almost be a little bit of a red coat, Butlins. You had to engage them with different stories and scenarios that they can connect with. So it's almost, we're going to do Space Invaders, and we're going to do this, and you're going to invade that place. And it's almost getting the kids to create their own story in relation to, well, what do we want this practice to be? Is this practice giving us what we want? Are we using our imaginations to be having fun, but also learning something about travelling with the ball, dribbling with the ball? And if we're not, what could we do with it? Because I think, going back to the hidden curriculum stuff, that if you dress it up in a game where there's a little bit of a story, and I know we used to do one where you're taking your dog for a walk, the dog is the ball, the lead is your foot, you're taking for a sprint, getting it to sit, getting it to stay. If when you say dog warden, they have to put their foot on the ball, because if your ball's still moving and the dog's off the lead, the dog warden will take your ball away from you. And kids will engage with that sort of storyline more than we're going to do dribbling tonight and this is what it's going to look like, because there's a bit of fun. They get to be a dog catcher, they get to be someone who eludes the dog catcher, and they can choose how that develops. And you can review with them, because I would say that you would need several practices for under 8s, potentially, or like Maya said, a rectangle, a halfway line, some goals, for them to then go and practice it in a smaller format. It could be 2v2, 3v3, with the direction now. So we're not just multi-directional, we're not just running around a boxed off area, we're giving them some purpose to their practice.
I'm sure there's plenty out there plenty that we've just discussed that the coaches out there can latch onto and recognise and help them. I've been furiously taking notes as we've been going through, and we will link up some of the previous Bootroom articles. One of the previous Bootroom magazines actually was completely devoted to practice design. We'll link that up in the show notes. If coaches want some more resources or some more ideas, almost like you referred to before, templates from which they can structure or scaffold practices further from, if coaches listening in, if you Google FA Vimeo level 1, you'll find a whole host of practices that we're using, or templates rather, that we're using on our level 1 course, that we think coaches don't have to worry about numbers when they're using, so they can be just as effective with 6 players as they might be with 16. I want to just close up with some regular questions that the listeners have given us. So these are questions that are quite short in nature, but you can take as much or as little time as you want to answer them. And Simon, we'll start with you first. So what have you seen or read recently that's impacted on you or your coaching?
There's a book called Nudge by Thaylor and Sunstein. I believe it's Thaylor and Sunstein, and it's about how you use social nudges to get people to, or influence people in their behaviour. And one of the ones that's quite entertaining, you might have seen it on a Volkswagen advert, is a musical keyboard, staircase, or the escalator. So the nudge is to try and get people to not use the escalator and use the steps, because of the returns for physical development, and exercise. And because it's fun, interesting, people will go up and down the stairs regular, maybe 3 or 4 times, playing a tune. And it's those little nudges that I try and encourage people to use within their club setting, rather than them shouting and screaming at people. How do I influence the behaviour that I would like to see in kids? What nudges do I have for them? What nudges do I have for parents? And I think I've seen some great ones on Twitter. Remember, this is a game for kids, these are volunteers, this is a referee who's volunteering, which are fantastic to remind people again of the setting where they're working and the behaviours we would like to see people exhibit. And they can definitely do that within their coaching practice. So one of the social corner of the 4-corner model, socialisation, what would be the behaviours I would like people to have as good citizens and when they're with me for that hour a week, do I want them to be well-mannered? Do I want them to accept and embrace challenge? Do I want them to be kind-hearted to each other? Whatever the values and beliefs that someone holds dear to them, how do they start to get them social nudges into their young people, so then they go away feeling that the experience they've had with football is not just football-based, it's wider and goes beyond that.
So skill acquisition, I referenced Damien, Farrow. I'm an avid, spend a lot of time in the car and listen to quite a few podcasts. There's one out there called Perception Action Coupling, which is very psychology driven, not probably for everybody, but there are some decent nuggets in there. So Damien Farrow does a recent podcast on their perception action coupling,
and that is that's something I listen to myself. It's probably for the listener who likes the in-depth scientific analytic approach. Would you agree, Mark?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. But linked to that, so Farrow's looking at how do we develop different practice structures to support learning and player development. I mean, they do. He has edited a book called Developing Sports Expertise, which is very readable because it gives a perspective from academic research, but then links it to a practicing coach and says, what does this mean in plain English or plain language to you? So that's quite a good one. Recently did a bit of research around behaviour management for a workshop I delivered in Sussex, and what stood out for me there was as a little mini project to delve into. It was very interesting. What stood out to me was 95% of the issues with behaviour management are down to adults, whether they be parents, what the parent does or what the coach does, as opposed to what the child does. So if things aren't going well, probably the first person to look at would be ourselves and go, is there anything I could have done better? So this idea that the kids aren't good enough probably isn't good enough as an excuse when we're reflecting on why the practice didn't work. Now, sometimes kids can be challenging, I get that, but yeah, in my experience, let's look at what the adults are doing first. And the final one, in terms of for those coaches that are into the advanced technical tactical, there's a book by a guy called Jed C. Davies called In Shadows of Bielsa, and it looks at the philosophy of Marcelo Bielsa, the Chile coach, Argentinian Chile coach, and he's going to be working in France next year, so will be interesting. And what stands out there is the why in terms of the coaching philosophy comes first, and every single practice there's a reason for it and it fits in with that philosophy. Because probably the thing about professional football is the coaches at the top levels have less time to practice and train with their players than one might typically imagine, because of the demands of playing Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday, for example. So yeah, that would be well worth an investment of your time and money.
Brilliant, Mark. Next question, you might as well keep the mic, seeing as you've got it. What's the best investment that you've made in yourself that has had an impact on your coaching? Okay,
so two aspects. A long time ago, sounds like I'm about to break into song, doesn't it? No, it's not that kind of show. So probably my A licence 25 years ago. And again, what that gave me was a clear process of how to structure practices in a logical, methodical, sequential order, which I think is a good discipline. And again, coming from a teaching background, that also helped with that. I don't necessarily think we should always stick to that rigid structure, but to have that process and that discipline is quite useful. Probably more recently, I'm just as part of the support that the FA are giving us, we're doing a project around coaching, a postgraduate look at the research world of coaching, but it's great because it's applied to what we do. It's not theoretical. So I'm very big on give me information that I can use to help me be better and help coaches be better. Less interested in academia for academia's sake. So that's been brilliant in terms of opening my eyes. One of the biggest changes for me is a few years ago, probably less than that, even quite dogmatic in terms of tell them how it should be done. And what I'm realising is coaching's complex and there's more than one way to solve the problem, and it also relates to where the coach works. So there's some common things that we would say about coaching that these are good practice ideas, so part art, part science, but there's some things that will be general that would apply to any coaching environment. There are other things that will vary wildly based on where you coach, who you coach, and why they come to practice. So you're the under-8s grassroots coach or you're the under-18 academy coach, that's going to look different, and those would be big things that I've taken on board recently.
For myself, Jack, the same question. I've done numerous coach education courses across the years, across a variety of sports, and also when I used to work within youth work and trying to get disengaged teenagers into games, into sports. I learned lots of things from street games and the different ways to engage with people. But I think that the number one thing that I've learned throughout all of that is just being resilient and just wanting to keep learning and keep plugging away. I don't think there is one thing that has had the biggest impact. It's a series of little things which get you to consider. So even just a tweet that someone might put out which takes you to a research paper or just challenges your perceptions. And I think one of the things coaches should try and do if they can is try not to always source information that confirms your own bias. Challenge yourself to read things that actually challenge your point of view and are backed up with some sort of evidence as well, to say, well, actually there's some thoughts and beliefs that this is the way. So then you can rationalise, well, why do I believe in what I believe in? Because I believe that ultimately players are people. If you want to get the best out of players, you have to understand them, you have to individualise it, you have to make it bespoke to them so they feel special, so they feel, no, this person cares and wants to help me get better. Because if it just comes across as you're only in it for yourself and it's all about the result and they're just pawns to help you achieve that goal, then you're missing a trick. So going back to that letter to your younger self stuff, you know, I look back and a young player, I used to have great kids around the squad, but I was that coach back when I was 21 who would only let him play when we were 3-0 up with 5 minutes to go. And I think, well, what did I do to that young lad? You know, I could have done so much more to help him get better, but because I was chasing results at that younger age and not thinking about, well, if I get all of these players to a great standard, people are going to recognise me as a coach who can develop lots of players and not just one. And it's not just one player in the technical or the tactical corner or physically, it's a bigger overview of that. It's developing people, and it's almost people would go away and say, well, that's a Simon Millington player, because you can tell that you've had some sort of impact on them around the manners that you would like and the way they conduct themselves. Win, lose or draw, I think that's more important.
Some great advice there that I think coaches listening in will really be able to learn from, and it's a reminder that we shouldn't be married to our ideas and that we should be open to information that challenges us and makes us feel uncomfortable, and that's really important in our growth and development and journey as we go through. Last question before we wrap up. Simon, what have you changed your mind about with regards to your own coaching?
Well, I think I've referenced it already. The biggest change was telling and saying you must do this, and this is what successful players look like, and it's structured and it's linear and it looks great, and the parents are happy because they can see me be demonstrative, going to a more subtle approach, setting challenges, setting problems for people to try and overcome. And it's a lot longer term and it takes more planning, but I think the benefits of it will be far better in the long term than instructing. Instructing's easy, and if people think that's coaching, then I think they've got the wrong view of coaching. Coaching is about, for me, for developing people from where they were to a better place holistically, rather than, you know, I've got you to shut down a player because I've instructed you.
Okay, for me, so don't have to be in control of everything. My way is a way, not the way. So there's more options out there for coaches to explore, and probably the develop relationships before you develop your practices would be key. So I can't remember where I heard it. It comes from America, which may not translate brilliantly, but coaching is more about Jills and Joes than X's and O's, and that's a phrase that, you know, we might not use in this country, but it does sum it up for me in terms of develop the relationship with the players and then develop the practice off the back of that.
I think that's the shortest answer that Mark's ever given in his life, is it? So he's celebrating. Mark, Leigh, Simon Millington, can't thank you enough. This has been absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much from being around you and listening to what you've got to say. If coaches out there want to connect with you or learn more about what they're doing, Simon, you mentioned Twitter. I'm guessing that you're on there. Username would be?
At FACCD_Kent.
Cheers. It's what time are we?
10 past.
It's
25
past 8. We're an hour late for tea, so we'll get in there and get ourselves fed and watered. Thank you, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Jack. Brilliant.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please help spread the word or leave us a review on iTunes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. You can reach me on Twitter at JackWalton1, and don't forget to follow Liverpool FA at Liverpool_CFA. See you next time.